Hello, welcome to the session all about Troriluzole. It is my absolute privilege to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Susan Perlman. Dr. Perlman is a graduate of Cornell University and the State University of New York at Stony Brook School of Medicine. She did an internship in medicine, her residency in neurology, and a 2-year fellowship in Friedreich's ataxia at UCLA Medical Center. Dr. Perlman is currently a clinical professor of neurology and director of the Ataxia Center at UCLA Medical Center in Los Angeles, California. She's been the head of the Ataxia Center in UCLA since 1983. She has worked in ataxia diagnoses for over 30 years and has networked with other ataxologists across the country and around the world, trying to build better collaborations in the development to develop treatments and ultimately cures for ataxia. She has helped develop the National Ataxia Database for clinical research. She is participating in 2 natural history studies for dominant ataxia as well as Friedreich's ataxia, and has participated in 7 clinical drug trials. Dr. Perlman would like to expand the work being done in non-genetic ataxias as well. Dr. Perlman has authored Evaluations and Management of Ataxia Disorders, an overview for physicians, which has become a valuable resource for the National Ataxia Foundation, and she also serves on NAF's Medical Research Advisory Board and is also an ex-officio member of NAF's Board of Directors. And with that, Dr. Perlman, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak about one of my favorite topics, since I think people who know me know that I like to reassure individuals that there's always something that can be done, and the growth in drug trials and potential drugs in the pipeline has been astronomical in the last several years. So that about 5 or 6 years ago, I reinvented myself as a clinical trialist, and we now at my center have 20 trials running. Some of them are natural history studies, some of them biomarker studies, and some of them are drug trials. And we have expanded into drug trials for non-genetic ataxia as well. So these are my disclosures. As you can see, I'm always willing to offer my opinions to anybody who asks, and I try to back it up with some knowledge, and I'm going to try to share that knowledge with you today. I will not be presenting any material that is not already publicly available, and I'll let you know where you can find some of the information that will appear on these slides. So these are the basics of troriluzole. So we could summarize it here in one slide. It's a once-a-day oral drug that is owned by Biohaven Pharma. A new drug application is planned to be submitted to the FDA soon. Until FDA approval, it is available only through research or through the new expanded access program that Biohaven has opened up. Troriluzole is a prodrug of riluzole, which means that it turns into riluzole in your system before it reaches your brain. So you take a pill, goes into the stomach, gets absorbed from the stomach, bypasses the liver, goes into circulation, and turns into regular riluzole, which we will talk more about. Riluzole is a drug approved for amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS, and it was found to extend survival for patients in the early stages of this desperate disease, or to extend the time until they needed breathing support. So it suggested that it was neuroprotective in its mechanism. European studies of riluzole 10 to 15 years ago in ataxia did show symptomatic benefits after about 8 weeks in one study, and also benefits over a 1-year-long study that came afterwards. Neither riluzole or troriluzole is a cure for ALS or for ataxia, but it may be neuroprotective or symptomatically helpful. So this was a treatment guideline, a comprehensive review that was put out by the American Academy of Neurology and is due to be updated, looking at treatment of cerebellar motor dysfunction and ataxia, looking at all the publications over the last 20 years or so that purported to be treatments for ataxia. And the ones that came out at the top of the list, riluzole was one of the ones that was felt to be acceptable for off-label use in ataxia. And they cited the 2 studies that I had mentioned on the previous slide, where looking at various rating scales, the ICARS, the International Cooperative Ataxia Rating Scale, And the SARA, the Scale for Assessment and Rating of Ataxia, that I think many of you are familiar with, found that those two studies were well-developed, well-performed Class 1 studies, and did support the fact that there could be some usefulness of riluzole, this is regular riluzole, in the ataxic disorders. They did say that patients receiving riluzole required monitoring of liver enzymes. And I added here, if you don't have ALS, your insurance company may not pay for regular riluzole to treat your ataxia. If you are self-pay, if you're caught in that situation, the cost per month could be upwards of $1,000. Or with a discount pharmacy coupon, and there are several out there, it could be as low as $20 per month. So here are the two molecules. On the left, we have troriluzole, which is the Biohaven drug, the prodrug. On the right, we have regular riluzole. And if you look closely, you'll see that on the left, the left-hand part of that slide, you know, the molecule they show is very similar. And I've got my little arrow. I don't know if you can see it. So this part of the molecule, very similar to the regular riluzole molecule. And the end over here, the NH2, is still there on the regular riluzole. So the prodrug has had this middle section cut out, turning it into riluzole, which is the actor in this component. So we've had some pre-submitted questions that have been coming into NAF over the last few months. How does troriluzole work? Why does it help ataxia? And why is an Alzheimer's drug being used for ataxia? And, you know, as I was able to see on the Biohaven website, they are actually looking at the use of troriluzole for not just ALS as an alternative drug to regular riluzole, but potentially for Alzheimer's and for certain psychiatric conditions. Apparently, its mechanism of action is applicable in all those areas of the brain. So here's a diagram. On the right-hand side of this slide, I have a diagram of the synapse in the cerebellum where troriluzole has its action, and regular riluzole as well. You can see at the top of that picture is a blue nerve ending, which is full of glutamate, which it sends out into the synapse, where you see the little gray circles that are labeled glutamate, which are then absorbed onto the surface of the pink ending below it, which is the Purkinje cell, in order to open that purple channel to activate the electrical activity of the Purkinje cell. So it's a chemical electrical connection. And then that purple cell that's off to the left-hand side is an astrocyte. It's a supportive cell that supports nutrition and structure in the brain. And when the glutamate has done its job, it's reabsorbed into the astrocyte, where it is turned back into glutamine, put back into the blue nerve ending, and made into glutamate again. So there's a recycling, you know, very ecologically sound and efficient to keep glutamate presence active and ideally to prevent it from building up. So on the left-hand side of the slide, I've got some science that explains this in a little more depth. So riluzole and troriluzole is a glutamate modulator. So it modifies what glutamate is doing on its way to stimulate Purkinje cells. The Purkinje cells have 4 different types of receptors on their surface that could interact with glutamate. The AMPA receptors open channels that allow sodium to flow into the Purkinje cell and generate an electrical signal, so the Purkinje cell can then communicate with the rest of the cerebellum and hence to the rest of your nervous system. The NMDA receptors, which are opened up by glutamate, allow calcium to flow into the Purkinje cell, which helps with downstream signaling, remodeling the synapse. It has some very important activities, but it does have a potential for overstimulating the Purkinje cells. You know, if too much calcium flows in, because the NMDA receptor is overactivated and hence overactivates the Purkinje cells. That overactivation can lead to dysregulation of the glutamate signaling and death of the nerve cell. Riluzole or troriluzole reduce the glutamate level in the synapse. That's those little gray dots floating around between the pink and blue nerve endings, so that it enables more of the glutamate to be taken up into the purple astrocyte, so that it doesn't build up in the synapse and doesn't overstimulate the Purkinje cells. And again, it could work in other parts of the brain, not just the cerebellum. Alzheimer's disease and the part of the brain that controls anxiety, bipolar disorder, etc. Until troriluzole is approved, we aren't going to have official guidelines for its ideal usage. And, part of the FDA's approval, they're going to have to put together, information sheets for patients and for prescribers. So some of the questions that came in, I've provided what I think are reasonable answers. How often do you need to take troriluzole? It's once a day, and the proposed dose is 200 milligrams. How do you take troriluzole? It is a pill and can be taken with or without food. Some medicines you have to take on an empty stomach. This one, it doesn't matter. Food does not influence how well it's absorbed from your stomach. Can I take troriluzole and other medications at the same time? Yes. Can I take troriluzole and vitamins or supplements at the same time? Yes. And I came to this, trying to go through some of the information that Biohaven had provided for the clinical trial, but also looking up riluzole. There really would be no interactions with any of the common things that you might have in your daily regimen. Any other drug, though, that you might be taking that could put stress on the liver should be used cautiously with troriluzole. Or if you have pre-existing liver disease, or your liver is already under significant stress, you might want to rethink trying troriluzole because it could potentially add to liver damage. How much does troriluzole cost? We won't know until it receives FDA approval for marketing, but the average cost for a unique new brand name drug can be very, very high. And I looked it up online. It said the median annual list price for any new drug in the US was $300,000 per year in 2023. And that apparently didn't matter if it was an injectable drug or a pill. It was a very, very large amount. So anticipating this, Biohaven has proposed to improve access to troriluzole when it is FDA approved by a comprehensive patient access and healthcare provider support network. And here you can see the pieces they have put into place or will be putting into place to make sure that cost is not going to be an impenetrable barrier for any SCA patient who might receive benefit from troriluzole. So this, they're looking forward, hopefully, to approval and to being able to support the patient community in obtaining this drug. So what are the side effects of troriluzole? This I took out of the consent form for the expanded access program. It's very similar to the consent form for the study itself. And don't worry about the fine print. When you try to figure out how they get a list of potential side effects that's this long, when you're involved in a clinical trial, and many of you have been, any little thing that happens that's out of the ordinary gets written down as a potential side effect. You fall and break a bone. You bump into something and get a scrape. You have weight gain or weight loss that may not at all be related to taking the medication. You might develop a cold or bronchitis or pneumonia. Again, not necessarily related to taking the drug, but because it happened during the study, it gets written down as an adverse event. And then the people who run the study can, look at the doctors who were involved in the study and get their thoughts. Do you think it's due to the drug? Do you think it's due to something else? But they still have to list everything. But if we go through the list and look at the most common side effects, which would be present in 5% or more of people, which increases the odds that it's due to the drug: headache, dizziness, fatigue, nausea. Those are kind of the four primary ones that could be expected to happen to someone starting troriluzole who's never experienced it before. Allergic reactions could occur, but are very rare. So breaking out in a rash, having trouble breathing, anything that comes on after the first or second dose that could be an allergy, obviously stop taking the medicine and report it to your prescribing doctor. And many times the drug company will have a pharmacy call-in line that you can directly report allergic reactions or other unusual reactions so they can track them independently. So comparing it to regular riluzole, where the following adverse events were seen, and again, 2 to 5% of people, you look at fatigue, you look at nausea, and they are well over 15% of people experience that. Dizziness, 4%, not so bad. And some of the other side effects, again, smaller numbers of people. But, the fatigability and potential GI upset, much more common with regular riluzole and relatively less common in people taking troriluzole. So compared to regular riluzole, troriluzole has benefits. You take it once a day as opposed to twice a day. You can take it with food or without food. Regular riluzole you're supposed to take on an empty stomach. Troriluzole is easier on the liver and has similar side effects, but at much less frequency than regular riluzole. So these are some of the additional cautions that were put out for the use of troriluzole as part of the expanded access program. Now, any drug that gets into your brain, whether it's a seizure drug or a pain medication or a drug like this, which affects neurotransmitters, the FDA and the medical community recognize that it could cause depression, it could increase thoughts of suicide on a chemical basis. So they want people to be alert to any mood changes and certainly any thoughts of suicide that might start after you begin any drug that is active in your brain. And they have reference to the suicide hotline. They also do not want people who are taking troriluzole at this time to donate blood or plasma because the drug will be present in your bloodstream, and they don't want a transfusion of your donated blood containing troriluzole to go to somebody who might have an allergy or might have an unexplained adverse event related to that. And then finally, they don't want people getting pregnant or causing pregnancy while they are taking this drug. In the animal studies, there were some concerns regarding, pregnant animals and how they did when exposed to this drug, usually at high dose. But on the safe side, for people taking troriluzole in the expanded access program or ultimately after it's approved, there's no guarantee or known guarantee about its safety in pregnancy. So, question, does troriluzole work for all spinocerebellar ataxias? Does it work for an ataxia that is not spinocerebellar ataxia? So in the 2 European studies, they did include patients with Friedreich's ataxia and other ataxias that were not classically SCAs. Those weren't huge studies. They had under 100 people in each study, but had a variety of diagnoses that could cause ataxia. And the outcome suggested it could be helpful, even in a non-SCA diagnosis. So I had the same questions. So with the support of Biohaven, I designed an investigator-initiated study of troriluzole in other ataxias, figuring it could work for Purkinje cells anywhere. So I had an open pilot trial of the drug, troriluzole, under an investigator-initiated IND. So the company agreed, the FDA agreed that I could conduct this study. I ended up enrolling close to 30 people, monitored them for 6 months. I had 4 groups. other predominantly cerebellar ataxias that were not included in the trials that Biohaven was running. Cerebellar ataxia with predominant dizziness, since many patients with SCA or ataxia in general have a lot of dizziness, which can be more disabling than the ataxia itself. And I wanted to see what the impact would be on dizziness, knowing that dizziness is a potential side effect. Patients with cerebellar ataxia who had been on riluzole and switched to troriluzole, I wanted to see how they did. And also people with non-genetic ataxia, multiple system ataxia, subtype C. Followed people for 24 weeks and used the SARA scale as my outcome measure. So in people with other cerebellar ataxias, I enrolled 10. 2 stopped after 3 months, one because of dizziness, one had a fall with injury. But of the remaining 8, 5 clearly improved on their SARA exam. In the dizzy cohort, and these were people who had various SCAs that had a lot of dizziness, 4 enrolled, 3 stopped because they felt more dizzy. 1 was still dizzy but wanted to continue. In the cohort switching from regular riluzole to troriluzole, 4 enrolled. All were the same or slightly better than they were on riluzole. And the ones on riluzole whose liver function tests were a little elevated, the liver tests came back to normal. So it did appear that troriluzole might work better than regular riluzole and might be better tolerated. In the non-genetic multiple system atrophy cohort, I enrolled 11. 5 discontinued after 3 months due to dizziness, and their balance was worse. 2 had progression of their multiple system atrophy into the Parkinson's area, which this drug is not expected to help. And 3 of the group were minimally improved. So, it suggested there might be an impact, maybe in the MSA, primarily cerebellar features, but not as dramatic as in the spinocerebellar ataxias. What symptoms does troriluzole control? In the studies that the FDA will be looking at, improvement was measured by the functional SARA scale. So it wasn't the full SARA scale, but it was a smaller portion of it, which only tracked walking, standing, sitting, and speech. These were felt by the FDA to be most important in a person's daily life, most functionally important, and ideally would improve with a drug that was actually doing what we hoped it would do. So does troriluzole stop all symptoms? No. For example, dizziness was not stopped and was not apparently benefited either. But we don't know what impact it might have on hand coordination, because that was not included in the study as it was conducted. Does troriluzole slow down symptoms? It appears to, when compared to patients in the natural history study, which was something that Biohaven did. They took a comparative group matched for gender, age of ataxia onset, type of ataxia, and their functional SARA score, and compared them over a 3-year period of time to the treatment group that was on troriluzole and then the natural history control group that was not taking it. And this has been published on the Biohaven website. There was a webinar as well as a slide presentation looking at the top-line pivotal trial results for troriluzole in spinocerebellar ataxia. So this came out of the first year when patients were either on placebo or real drug. So they were measuring the functional SARA. They were looking at other things patients reported, including falls. In the functional SARA, that very restricted scale, over the course of a year, they couldn't pick out a statistically significant improvement in the scale itself between the placebo group and the treatment group. The scale is probably not very sensitive. didn't include hand coordination, which could have benefited. And at the end of the first year, the statistics didn't support that troriluzole was better than placebo. However, the keeping track of falling in the falls diary did show that patients with spinocerebellar ataxia in the study were much less likely to fall than those on placebo. And when they looked at, the people on drug who, were monitoring their falls, some of them were really not ambulatory anymore. They were using more and more a wheelchair. And that, by definition, is going to reduce their falls. But even so, most spinocerebellar ataxia patients did report a reduction in falls. And, the more you fall, the more likely you are to have an injury. So I think as a practical measure of how well a drug is working to improve balance, reducing falls is going to be very clinically meaningful. Then, over the next 2 to 3 years, when all patients were placed on open label drug as part of the open label extension, in the most recent study, which finished a year ago, the target dose was 200 milligrams taken once a day. And over a 3-year time frame, using the functional SARA rating scale, they were able to show slowing of disease progression to the equivalent of delaying disease progression by upwards of 2 years over that 3-year study period. So people seemed to stabilize, and if they got worse, it was at a much slower rate. And they did several analyses of this open label data as requested by the FDA. They turned it around 9 different ways, and each way they looked at it, it was statistically significant. And the safety data about any severe side effects was also very, very encouraging. So here is the comparison to people in the US natural history study. In the graph, the dark line at the top of the graph is the progression of ataxia in the people enrolled in the natural history study who were matched to the participants in the drug trial, while the green line showed progression, change in the functional SARA from the beginning, the baseline, out through the 3-year mark in people who were taking troriluzole. And you can see that the error bars don't overlap, and it appears that the delay in progression, that the troriluzole group was saved, was equivalent to 1.5 years of being stabilized and not progressing at the rate that they would have been expected to progress. And this was, calculated to reduce SCA disease progression by about 50%. Next slide. And in the next slide, we see a similar data comparison between the European natural history study, again, patients matched for all the factors that we mentioned. And on the European side, over a 3-year period, progression on average was much more rapid than we see in America. And we have no idea why that difference is. Is the disease more severe in Europe? Is there lifestyle changes that might, mellow the disease in America as opposed to in Europe? We really don't know. But comparing patients matched in the trial, that green line on the bottom, as opposed to the natural history in the matched European group, they saved them 2 years of progression. And you can see that over the first year, the second year, and the third year, there was some progression, but at a much slower rate than was seen in the untreated natural history controls. So how can I access troriluzole? And what is an expanded access program? So this used to be called compassionate use, and it's a potential pathway for a patient with a serious or life-threatening disease to get access to an investigational drug or treatment that is not yet approved when there are no comparable alternative therapy options out there. When seeking expanded access to an investigational medical product, it's important that the patient and their physician consider the potential risks. These are drugs that have not yet been approved by the FDA and, may have, risks that may ultimately, prevent approval, but certainly could be serious risks for any individual. The FDA, the drug company, and the physician work together to authorize expanded access so that, the physician has to have a plan, the drug company has to agree to supply the drug, and the FDA has to agree that it's overall safe and being monitored appropriately. So how does expanded access compare to right to try, which is a more recent approach to getting access to unapproved drugs? So the key points about right to try: eligible patients, again, are those with life-threatening illnesses who have no other treatment options and aren't qualified to participate in a clinical trial for that drug because their age is wrong, they're too disabled, or other factors. The investigational drug must have finished a phase 1 clinical trial and be actively under development and have shown adequate safety in that phase 1 trial. So there are some guidelines to its use. The drug company ultimately has to decide whether it will provide access to their investigational drugs under the Right to Try Act. And the FDA does not have a say in this. It doesn't directly oversee this process, but it does receive certain information related to it. But, here it's a direct negotiation between the patient, their physician, and the drug company, and the FDA doesn't weigh in accessing via right to try. So here's the information about the current expanded access protocol for troriluzole. It's listed on clinicaltrials.gov under that ID number. It's an intermediate size patient population expanded access protocol. So it's not designed for thousands of patients, but it is designed probably for more than 30 patients, the ones I had in my individual trial. It's going to provide use of troriluzole to patients with spinocerebellar ataxia who are considered to be eligible in the clinical judgment of the treating physician. The population includes both troriluzole naive patients, people who have never tried it, and rollover of patients who have participated in the previous trials. And all of them have a confirmed diagnosis of spinocerebellar ataxia. So how do you access it? If you go to the clinicaltrials.gov website, they have a study contact. They have a phone number and an email access where you can contact and leave your information. There are potentially 21 sites participating in the expanded access study. These are the same sites that participated in the original studies. Not all of these sites are guaranteed to be participating in expanded access. And sites that are not part of the original studies may also participate. Currently, there are 7 or 8 sites that are enrolling in the expanded access, and Biohaven is working on opening expanded access program sites in Europe and the United Kingdom. So access to this drug may well spread outside of the United States to other countries. So who is eligible for this program? The key inclusion criteria: you have to be at least, misspell, sorry about that, at least 18 years of age or older. You have to have a confirmed diagnosis of spinocerebellar ataxia, defined either as clinical evidence, they know there's a SCA in your family and you have symptoms that are very similar to your other family members, or you yourself have had a confirmed genetic diagnosis. And I received information this morning, which I probably should have known. And originally I thought that only people with the diagnoses that were part of the original study would be included in expanded access. And that was spinocerebellar ataxia type 1, 2, 3, 6, 7, 8, and 10. But I was told this morning by the people at Biohaven that anybody with a genetically identified dominant spinocerebellar ataxia number 1 through 50 is eligible to screen for the expanded access program. And you have to have adequate liver function. Exclusion criteria: if you have any kind of severe liver disease, obviously the judgment of the physician enrolling you is going to play into this. But if you already have a compromised liver, adding a drug that could potentially stress your liver is not a good idea. And if you have a history of any clinically significant medical condition that could be made worse by starting a drug that isn't yet approved, or would place you at increased risk, that they would hesitate to enroll you in this study. And if you're pregnant or nursing, you would not be able to enroll in this expanded access program. So the requirements of the expanded access program: much of this is left to the judgment of the physician who is enrolling you. There's a consent form that would have to be signed and a screening visit conducted. And ideally, this is going to be in person. The enrollment website assigns a patient code number to you after you pass the screening visit, and it doesn't include any identifiable personal health information. You get a code number which protects your personal health information and your identity. Biohaven, however, does request information about your gender, your race, your ethnicity, your type of ataxia, your functional SARA score, medical history, and a physical exam. And again, it goes in under your code number. The drug is dispensed through the prescribing physician's research pharmacy at the baseline visit. So there's a second point of contact. It starts with 140 milligrams daily for a month, and then increases to 200 milligrams daily. Rollover patients who in the study originally were taking 280 milligrams, which was the highest dose they went up to, will be allowed to continue on that dose, or they may choose to go back to 200 milligrams. Follow-up can be as frequent as monthly for the first 3 months, with blood work obtained at each visit. After the first 3 months, follow-up might be stretched to every 3 months for the first year, and then every 6 months. And again, attention is being paid to, blood work, which will include liver function studies. Follow-up information about any adverse events is collected for Biohaven, so they can track any side effects that might be happening in the real world. So when will troriluzole be approved? Hopefully during 2025, but there's really no way to predict that without a crystal ball. What data does the FDA need to see about troriluzole? I mean, the data that I just showed you, as well as safety data. And the FDA has trended in the last few years to be more relaxed about looking at orphan drugs for rare diseases, not requiring the same type of proof that they would require for, the 50th arthritis drug that is being presented to them. So they are more relaxed about, as long as safety is met, about, assurances that biomarkers look good, that the drug is trending to benefit, and that there does appear to be some clinically meaningful benefit. So what are the next review steps for troriluzole, and how long does approval take? So the process for submitting a new drug application to the FDA, I got this right from the FDA website. You prepare a new drug application package, collecting all your data and documents to put it into a complete package. You then may have a pre-submission meeting, so they can take a pre-look at your package of data and see if they need any more information or anything changed about the way you are analyzing or presenting the data. Then ultimately you submit your data package electronically. The FDA will review the new drug application to assess the safety, benefits, and quality of the data. And this review can take multiple rounds of communication with the drug company that is applying. So, you like to think that, for instance, with my investigator-initiated study or a single subject study, we give our information to the FDA and they have to respond within a month. Here, the process might take longer. And ultimately, they'll receive a decision that the FDA will either approve the new drug application or issue a non-approval letter. If troriluzole is approved by the FDA, when will it be available outside the USA? So I typed into my Google search, thank you AI, for coming up with a list of guidelines for what other countries do with unapproved drugs. So pharmaceutical companies that are seeking drug approval outside the US, to market and promote their products in those countries, the process for drug approval varies from country to country. And the FDA has agreements with foreign regulatory authorities to facilitate the drug approval process. There can be mutual recognition agreements where the FDA can enter into agreements with foreign regulatory authorities to recognize their drug inspections if they meet US requirements. And this allows drug inspectors to rely on information from each other's inspections, where, it used to be, if a drug was approved in the US, Canada would automatically approve it. That doesn't actually happen anymore these days. Canada is being a little more circumspect with that. In the European Union, they have different approaches to drug approval, including centralized, national, mutual recognition, decentralized procedures. Drugs approved in one EU state can be marketed in other EU states, but so a lesson learned from Skyclarys is after Skyclarys was approved by the FDA in February of 2023, it took almost a full year for the European Union to approve Skyclarys for Friedreich's in Europe. So there can be delays in getting international approval. And on the other side, flip the coin, FDA approval after approval outside the US, 2/3 of drugs that are first approved outside the US are later approved by the FDA, and the median time between being approved outside and being approved within the US is a little over a year. So these are some useful websites, which I usually refer to for people who want more information about most of these items. And the Friedreich Ataxia Research Alliance and the National Ataxia Foundation help track clinical trials, and the Clinical Trials Registry is the official place where any clinical trial needs to be registered. And that was just a thank you to my team and the donors that have supported my program. So turning it back to Celeste.
Thank you so much, Dr. Perlman, for sharing all that information with us. I know this can be quite complicated, so thank you for explaining it to us. We're now going to move to our open Q&A portion of today's talk, and we already have 69 questions that have been submitted. So just as a reminder, if you have a question for Dr. Perlman about troriluzole, please put it in the Q&A window, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. We have 11 minutes left in our hour today, and we're going to get through as many questions as possible. So Dr. Perlman, back to you.
Okay, thank you. So the first question, it registered 1 minute into my talk. This may be genetic disease progression altering drugs for dummies, but at least troriluzole is not felt to alter the disease mechanism in any of the SCAs. It alters one of the dominoes that has fallen over further down the track, where you have Purkinje cells, in this case, that have been damaged, are hyperexcitable, and you need to control the glutamate stimulus. And that's what troriluzole and riluzole do. So why is it thought that troriluzole could help in multiple types of spinocerebellar ataxia? Other drugs, Skyclarys as an example, would not be expected to have a benefit in anything outside Friedreich's, except the target in Friedreich's is also not the primary cause of that disease. It's the mitochondrial dysfunction that results from the primary cause of Friedreich's. And there are other disorders, other ataxic disorders, Huntington's disease, where there is mitochondrial dysfunction that theoretically could benefit from Skyclarys. But you're right, a gene therapy is going to have to be tailored to the specific genetic disorder. But in any spinocerebellar ataxia where Purkinje cells are being damaged, and this could include Friedreich's, a drug like riluzole, troriluzole, could be helpful. So Marie has asked my feelings about whether it might be approved for SCA other than those included in the trial. And that's a big debate right now. Is the FDA going to be very rigid and only approve it for the SCAs that were part of the trial? Will it get a more general label that could include any of the SCAs? And Celeste would like to provide another comment on that.
Oh, sorry. I'm just marking off whatever questions
All
that you have
right.
answered.
Unless you have some inside information, but
Alas, I do not. I wish I
I'm
did.
hoping that because of the expanded access includes all the SCAs, that any real world data they collect from the expanded access could support a broader label from the FDA. Side effects less than riluzole, definitely, but they're not zero. What effect will this drug have on liver and kidneys? It's not going to have a damaging effect on kidneys, and the effect on liver, a small percentage of people had elevations of liver enzymes, and I don't think there was any serious liver damage from troriluzole. And how often is blood work monitoring required? The details of the expanded access is monthly for the first 3 months and then every 3 months for a year. And after that, at the discretion of the prescribing physician. But there is some flexibility with that. And is this medication advised for acquired ataxia? Some of the patients I included in my individual study had acquired ataxia. It was not genetic. It was from, an illness or something, and they were in the responder group. So I would say that any cerebellar-mediated ataxia could respond to this drug that stimulates and protects the Purkinje cells. How does someone find a doctor who would be aware of this medication and or trials with it? Well, you can contact the expanded access program information that I had posted. You can talk to the National Ataxia Foundation, who have, a group of doctors that work with them who are all very aware of this drug. What would be the procedure to procure the drug overseas in countries like India? So as part of the natural history study, as part of drug trials in general, we have had international patients who traveled to our site and participated. So it's likely that if you are living outside the US and have a relationship with a US physician who's doing the natural history study or has been part of this trial, that you could make a screening and baseline visit and get the expanded access classification, and then be able to work with the drug and be monitored safely and conveniently even after you return home. So this obviously needs to be discussed with the physicians who might be working with you. Will this medication stop the cerebellum from atrophying? I think the top line answer for that is no. It does not affect the gene stress that is occurring. But if it does protect Purkinje cells, just like it slows progression of the disease, it could slow atrophy of the cerebellum. And we just need more sensitive measures of the cerebellum, which there are research groups, here and in the rest of the world working on, to be able to show that atrophy has also been slowed. Is there a timeline estimate for obtaining FDA approval? I think the earliest we could hear would be sometime in the first quarter of next year, but it probably won't be till summer, and I don't know. And if anybody's writing this down, I'm already telling you I could be wrong. Will riluzole and troriluzole help non-genetic ataxia? So the acquired ataxias where people were left with cerebellar deficits, in my little study that I did seem to respond. For all of my ataxia patients, I recommend a trial of riluzole, as long as there aren't any safety issues, figuring if we can prop up the Purkinje cells, we can improve the symptoms of ataxia. So Richard says, my study was dismissed unexpectedly in October. Is there a way to continue the treatment? That is odd. If you were enrolled in one of the original Biohaven studies, and the study, the 201 study, I'm thinking is the one that closed, in the fall, the intent was to roll everybody over into the expanded access. So you need to contact the site that stopped your study, find out if they're participating in expanded access. If not, then go to the expanded access program site and find out what site close to you, would be able to take you on. So here's Margaret has been on riluzole for 14 years. Is this drug similar? Riluzole is the active component of troriluzole. Troriluzole turns into riluzole in your system. So the primary benefit of being on troriluzole is potentially fewer side effects, easier dosing, easier on the liver. But if you have been on riluzole and feel stable or improved and are not really having side effects, no need at this point to consider switching. My neurologist recently this October offered me this drug. How? He said it was offered my, okay, not, okay. He said, I said he was 5 to 6 years too late, but thanked him. Okay. So probably your neurologist was offering you the expanded access program. The real trials began 5 to 6 years ago, but now expanded access is available even to people who were not part of the original trials. So for which types of spinocerebellar ataxia beyond SCA3 is troriluzole expected to provide benefits? So admittedly, in the early data analyses, SCA3 seemed to have the best response, in part because there were more people with SCA3 in the trial than any of the other SCAs. And the bigger numbers you have, the better the statistics work out. But I think with the additional analyses that Biohaven did, they showed benefits that could be measured in all of the SCA subgroups that were part of the study. And knowing the mechanism of action of troriluzole, they agree that any of the spinocerebellar ataxias could benefit. Now, Morrow says, I have ataxia, but don't have symptoms yet. Should I start troriluzole as soon as possible in order to delay potential symptoms in the future? It has not been determined that starting troriluzole pre-symptomatically will delay onset of symptoms. I'm thinking about the mechanism of action. It protects the Purkinje cells. Theoretically, it could delay onset of symptoms. But remember, when you have a defective gene, which apparently you have a positive gene test, there are several steps that, the bad protein is produced. It's broken up. It makes aggregates. The aggregates disturb many pathways that are responsible for the health of your brain, so that propping up the Purkinje cells against excitotoxicity is the last domino to fall over. And, in the beginning, there are other mechanisms that could be going on that would be not affected at all by troriluzole. So it remains to be seen in the future, should the drug get approved and get wider usage, will its use in people who are pre-symptomatic but getting close to the age when their parents developed symptoms, will they be able to stay out of the symptom range longer? We just don't know yet, but it's a very good question. Now, information on troriluzole versus 4-aminopyridine, particularly for SCA27B. Aminopyridine, very helpful for SCA27B, also helpful for SCA8 and for some of the other SCAs that I have worked with. I've used it in combination with regular riluzole, and I think we need to keep our options open. And when we look at that American Academy of Neurology report saying that off-label use of riluzole was appropriate, 4-aminopyridine was also cited as being appropriate for off-label use. And I think my timekeeper is back up here, and a lot of good questions remain, but I'm hoping that my presentation answered most of them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Perlman. Two quick notes. We did have some questions that we weren't able to get to today. So if you do have any remaining questions, please feel free to email research@ataxia.org. It might take us a little bit of time to get back to you, but we will try to find the information and send that to you as quickly as possible. Another question that was submitted a few times is if this session is being recorded. Yes, it is. It will be available on the National Ataxia Foundation YouTube channel in about a week. And with that, if everyone could join me at your individual computer screens to thank Dr. Perlman for sharing this information with us and answering all of our questions. We really appreciate your time and your expertise.
Thank you so much
Yeah.
for having me, and I look forward to good news about troriluzole.
And to all of you who spent the last hour with us, we really appreciate your time. We hope the session was helpful and you learned something new about Troriluzole. So wherever you are in the world, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.